This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Neat Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. We are in the very early stages of the new format, Edge of Eternities. As usual, the first video, like after my set review for a set completes, the first Needs and Notes video, is sort of a Cliff's Notes where I give you my best commons and uncommons for each color. Sort of a quicker way to get an overview of the format than watching the hours and hours of set review video that is out there. But if you do want to know my thoughts about all those cards, that playlist is available. I've drafted about 5 times already thanks to the early access event, and there is one card on this list that has moved up for me, but for the most part, the things we're going to see here are the same as they were in the set review in terms of where cards rank, as at this point it's too early for me to say, well, I was wrong about this. We don't have data at this point for me to really unequivocally say that about anything. So instead, this is just going to be me going through my best commons and uncommons for each color. As usual, let's start with white. I think white's third best common is auxiliary boosters. This card has a really decent rate. Like, we see 5 mana 3/4 flyer with upside be pretty decent, like one that puts a +1/+1 counter on something, for example. Be a pretty decent card in most limited formats. And I think this has even more upside than that does. Now, it doesn't generate typically that value immediately, but it kind of does, because it brings a body into play, equips itself to it. You've got 2 permanents. If your opponent kills a token, you still have the equipment. If your opponent kills the equipment, you still have the token. If the token ever goes down, you can equip it to something else for a surprisingly reasonable cost for limited. Like, paying 3 generic for that is a super good deal, especially in the late game, and it's the kind of buff that can make anything pretty threatening. Throw in the fact it gives you 2 artifacts and 2 permanents, and it overlaps into being good in lots of different decks in the format. Also, it's like the premier thing to grab with the 2 mana 1/1 uncommon guy who can tutor up equipment. Grabbing this at instant speed sometimes is pretty sweet. So, that's an extra bonus point that it gets, and I do think it's white's third best common. I think white's second best common is Banishing Light. This is a card we see all the time. It's not as premium as it once was. There once was a time where this would have easily been white's best common instead of being second and not being that far ahead of auxiliary boosters, to be honest. And auxiliary boosters is an example of why. Banishing Light, not good against that card, because you get 2 permanents. Your opponent isn't going to be able to answer it entirely with Banishing Light. But there are still enough things out there that this does answer, and it's flexible, it exiles. These are all things that are nice. It's not as amazing as it used to be, but Banishing Light is still a pretty good card overall. And I think it's probably white's best removal spell at common. We always get a white removal spell these days that does damage equal to the number of creatures or whatever. And that card's fine, but those cards never really end up in the conversation for best commons, or like being really good cards, because they are situational enough. Sometimes you can spend 1 mana or whatever on Focus Fire and get a really great deal, but it's conditional enough, it needs enough bodies, etc., that it's not amazing. Banishing Light is far less conditional, and it's still a pretty good card. But I do think there's one white common that's better, and that's Night Luminary. So, as I said in the set review, if you spend 4 mana on this to get a 3/2 and a 1/1, that would be a solid card in limited. It might be the third best common still. It might still be in this list. Maybe it'd be like 4th, but it would be pretty good. But it's way better than that, thanks to Warp, which gives you all kinds of bonuses. Not only do you get that Inner's Trigger, so you end up getting 2 tokens out of this in the end if you do have the time to warp it or, do it on turn 2. But that's part of the benefit too. A card like this fills 2 points on your curve. If you have this in your opening hand, you don't have a 2-drop, you do have a 2-drop, right? It's not the most exciting 2-drop, but you have one, and it works pretty nicely there. Then you play it on 4, that feels good too. Throw in the fact also that Warp works pretty nicely with stationing spacecraft. You can get a 3-power thing on board to station a spacecraft a little bit ahead of schedule here. And then throw in the fact that both black, white, and red, white are pretty good at going wide and can take advantage of all of those, the 2 tokens it makes, plus the other body really effectively. And you're in really good shape with Night Luminary. It's just a very efficient card. White's best uncommon, this one was close for me. I do think Starfield Shepherd is great. Every time I've played that card, it's felt amazing. I had a deck during early access where I could tutor up Rust Harvester, that one red mana 1/1 who can exile artifacts from your graveyard and turn them into burn spells and counters, and that was pretty gross. But even just grabbing, not a rare 1 mana card, just grabbing a plains with it when you warp it is good. Same upside the other warp cards have, and then you cast it again later, and you can get potentially a 3-for-1 here. And I do like that upside, but I think All Fate's Stalker is ultimately the best uncommon for me. It usually is when we have a Banisher Priest-like creature that can come in and exile something. It's already really good. Like, if this didn't have Warp, I might still consider... I'd probably put the Shepherd ahead of it, I guess. But with Warp, it gets even better. Because not only can you use it still to exile your opponent's thing so that you can get a blocker out of the way, right? You can also use it to blink your own thing for value. You can also use it to blink a token, to remove it entirely. There are so many things you can do with this just off of Warp that it's amazing. And then later it just turns into Banisher Priest. So, which is a great card. Add to the board, take away from your opponents. It's how you win a lot of games of Limited, and this card is an all-in-one card that can do it. Let's move now to blue, where I think the third best common is Self-Craft Mechan. So this starts out as a 4-mana 3/4. That's not amazing, but it is actually a solid stat line in Limited. I mean, obviously 4-mana 4/4 would be better, but 4-mana 3/4, you're sort of at a point where you're okay with it. I mean, it would need to have abilities. Luckily, this does. But higher toughness in Limited is often better because it puts it out of range out of super cheap removal. And this certainly does, especially if you can take advantage of the Interest trigger, which will make it a 4-mana 4/5 that draws you a card. You do have to have an artifact to sacrifice. That's not automatic in this set, but blue often doesn't have a problem. You've got landers, you've got robot tokens, you've got drone tokens. Like, there are 3 different kinds of tokens in this set that can be sacrificed to this, in addition to there being some stuff that's just good to sacrifice for value. And I also like that in a pinch, this can sack itself, and then you put the counter somewhere else. And it can always put the counter somewhere else, which I think is a big benefit overall, because if it only put it on itself, it wouldn't really have as immediate of an impact, but you could put the counter somewhere else on something that can use it immediately to turn what was a creature that couldn't attack into a creature that can attack. And you're also drawing a card. So the value is nice. I mean, maybe the Mechan is a little bit of a build-around card. If you don't have enough random artifacts, it's not nearly as good. But I love that the floor is 4 mana, draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. So, that's not the most amazing card, but that's the floor, and this card can do way more impressive things than that. I think the second best blue common is Lost in Space. We see this card in every set at this point. Sometimes it feels a little too colored by numbers. There are certain slots that are always there. The 4 mana instant, put target creature, your opponent chooses to put their creature on top or bottom of their library, then you get some small effect. It's in like every set lately. But it's always solid. It is a way for them to make sure that blue has at least one decent removal spell, which it doesn't always have. And they know by now that this is one. It's not amazing. It's the second best blue common, but yeah, it is a 1-for-1 trade. It's an instant. It can go after all artifacts, not just like spacecraft or something. Sometimes it would make it a little more narrow, right? That it would be spacecrafts, which are pretty gross to put on the top or bottom of a library after your opponent works to station them. That is a big problem. This is great against that, but it's good against other artifacts. It's good against creatures. Sometimes you get a huge blowout, like with spacecraft, or if your opponent tries to use a trick. And then it even has Surveil on top of that. So it's one of the better versions of this effect we've seen, because then you get some card selection. Maybe you load your graveyard for value. It just does what ends up being a pretty good effect. The 1-for-1 trade is awesome. People do often underrate this kind of card because it feels a little like a bounce spell, but it's not one. Don't make that mistake. Your opponent has to redraw the card or put it on the bottom. Either way, it's a 1-for-1 trade because you used a card and took one away from them. So it ends up being a solid effect. You're going to play like 2 of these in a lot of your blue decks and be perfectly happy with it. And then I think blue's best common is Mechanizoa. It feels like it should be an uncommon to me. Like, it wouldn't shock me if that's what it was. But no, it's a common. It's another card with Warp. You can see I'm pretty high on Warp. I love that, the multi taking up different spots on the curve and the flexibility and the fact you can cast them from exile. You just end up getting so much out of them. And Mechanizoa comes into play, taps something down, and stuns it. and then you can warp it earlier in the game for value 2. This kind of effect, it can vary in formats how good it is. But a lot of the time these days, it's straight up better than like a Mana War like effect because your opponent doesn't get their enters trigger that's on half their cards when you stun it down. They do have to pay mana again when you bounce something, and they don't with this, but I think that's perfectly fine. It adds a significant body to the board, taps something down. It happens to be an artifact. It has warp, so it overlaps into all these different synergy points in the set. And it's the kind of 6-drop that just feels great. Like you play this on turn 6 after you've just, played a few creatures, stun their best thing, attack. It's amazing. And there are lots of turns too where it's even better to warp it and then do some other stuff, or just do it on turn 3 so your 2-drop can get in. And of course, it works well with stationing. If you get it down early, put 5 counters on something on top of everything else, and it's going to feel really good. And I think Blue's best uncommon is Code Cracker Hound. This is this is kind of card that's obviously good because it's almost exactly a better version of Sib Sig Appraiser, one of the best commons we've seen in a limited format in the last couple of years. A 3-mana 2/1 that enters, lets you look at the top 2, put 1 in your hand and 1 to the graveyard. You're always playing that in every single blue deck in this format, and you're playing as many copies of it as you can get. It's a 2-for-1. It gives you really good card selection. And then it's kind of like the Assassin we looked at earlier, where like, I'd already really like this card if it didn't have warp. It'd already be great, but it does. So that means you can get this trigger twice if you want to. This is one where, it costs the same to warp it, right? So you don't always have the time in limited to play out not play out your Code Cracker Hound just to get that first trigger. Sometimes you need to play it, but that's what's great is it's like a B level card when you do cast it normally. And then when you have the time to warp it, or you have synergy that makes it worth warping it, you're going to do it because you end up getting a 3-for-1 that way. But casting it normally is also great. It's a 2-for-1. Those are always going to be amazing and limited, especially when they're this cheap. Like, if this just drew a card instead of the card selection, it would still be amazing, but you even get the best card out of your top 2. So let's move to black now, where I think black's 3rd best common is Grav Kill. So, a 4-mana instant that exiles target creature or spacecraft. It's a little more than you'd like to pay, but exiling is some real upside. Being able to go after spacecraft in addition to creatures is real upside. Turning off death triggers, turning off recursion, all of that stuff really matters. It does make this better. It's still not amazing because you end up overpaying or paying the same amount of mana your opponent did, and that's never a great way to use removal, but it's flexible enough and deals with enough things that it's a nice removal spell, and it's even splashable, which is nice. Black's 2nd best common, I think, is Virus Beetle. It was pretty much in this same slot in Neon Dynasty, where it was one of Black's best commons. And we have a lot of the same stuff going on here. Not all of the same stuff. One of the sweet things you could do with it in Neon Dynasty was use it with ninjutsu. So you tag with it, it gets in, ninjutsu something in, replay Virus Beetle. That was gross. But the big thing, the even bigger thing about Virus Beetle in that set was just that it was an artifact creature that was good. A cheap one you can get on the board early, that's good. And that's what it is. Every single time we see 2-mana 1/1, when this enters, each opponent discards. It's a solid or better limited card. You end up getting more than a card worth of value. Running it out on turn 2 is good. 2/1s feel miserable against it. And it makes for good sacrifice fodder too, because most of the value of this card comes from its trigger, not from, being a 1/1. And so when you can also sacrifice it after getting 80% of its value out of the discard, you end up getting even more value out of the card. And there are certainly good ways to sacrifice it in the format. And the fact it's an artifact is good synergy for the artifact decks in the format like blue-black. So it just does a lot for being a sort of unassuming looking 2-drop. And I think black's best common is Depressurize. So 2 mana for destroy target creature. Okay, it's not quite that good, but it's not that far. It feels a lot like Doomblade a decent chunk of the time, because there are so many things in this set it can kill, and it can trade up in a big way too. There are lots of 3 power or less creatures that cost way more than 2 mana in this set. There are 5 drops this can kill, and it can also deal with virtually all creatures in the early game. Sometimes it feels a little bit blank, but that's true of a lot of cheap removal. Like, you can't kill everything with it, but it kills things that it can kill so efficiently and at instant speed that I do think it's black's best common. Then black's best uncommon, I think black is super deep here. I do think Tragic Trajectory is really good. 1 mana for -2/2 is a card you always play. Getting Void going on it isn't that hard because it's so cheap. Just warping something and having 1 mana left over, for example, is very easy. Same thing, if you kill something and you have 1 mana left over, you can use this, and so then it can kill pretty much anything. But I think there's another black uncommon that's really in the conversation, and that is Monoist Circuit Feeder. This on its own is a 6 mana 4/4 that gives -0 -X to an opposing creature and +X +0 to your creature. That's the floor, and that's never what happens because black decks have a lot of artifacts like Virus Beetle running around, and it's not that hard for this to just turn into like a Chupacabra or Necrotal-like creature, comes down and kills something. But then it also offers a buff to one of your creatures that can often enable an attack. And even after all of that, you still have a 4/4 flyer in play, which isn't something your opponent can ignore for the most part. So it ends up giving you a ton of value. It's maybe a little more build-aroundy than Trajectory, which is good in literally every deck. But I think most black decks can use the Circuit Feeder really well. And I didn't even mention Dubious Delicacy, which also is definitely in this conversation. The 3 mana food with flash that gives -3/3, and then can do the usual food thing, or you can make your opponent lose life. So those are 3 black uncommons that I think are excellent, and all really in this conversation. All right, let's move to red now. Red's really deep at common. Bombard isn't going to make this list for me. I could see it ending up in the top 3, but right now I don't have it there, and that's kind of crazy because it's 3 mana, deal 4 at instant speed, which usually would make the list. But I think there are 2 creatures that are better, and another removal spell that is better, all at common. So I think red's 3rd best common is Kov Landseeker. A 4 mana 4/3 menace is not great these days, but it could be worse. But what really makes this so good is that it enters and creates a lander token. Unlike most cards that make lander tokens, this one does make you give up the lander token at the beginning of the end step on your next turn. So you don't have it forever, you can't keep it around to do stuff with, but a lot of the time it's best to just crack your lander as soon as possible anyway to fix your mana, trigger landfall, all of that kind of stuff. Also works well in artifact decks, makes it good sacrifice fodder since it's going to go away anyway. There's a lot you can do with that token in addition to what it does inherently. And then you also have a 4 mana 4/3 menace hanging around, which on its own wouldn't be great, but you get a whole card out of the lander too, so you end up getting really good value on this creature. I think red's 2nd best common, and it's the card that moved up for me in the early access event, and that is Zookeeper Mechan. I liked it in the set review, but I do think it's even better than I thought it would be. Like, I gave it a C+ in the set review, and I kind of feel like it's in B- territory. So there are a few things, 2 mana 1/3 that can tap for red is already a very good card that you're going to play in every deck. That's red anyway. And this has a lot more going on with it, even more than I thought about when I was evaluating the card. So first, it's an artifact. Did think about that, but that is a very real factor for lots of decks in the format. But also, it works really well with all of the red-white things that care about your creatures tapping. I didn't really think about that in the set review. I thought about my creatures attacking and stationing things would help set those cards up. That's obvious enough, right? But it turns out spending mana to cast one of those really good payoffs for having 2 tap creatures, which includes tapping this, ends up working out pretty nicely too. I had a deck with 3 of them where it was a great enabler for cards that cared about my creatures being tapped. And that activated ability, it's not entirely a throwaway. It is nice upside to have on it, but it's a small sample size at this point, but it was more relevant than I expected. It's good for stationing sometimes where you don't want to have to tap down as many creatures to get your space station, or spacecraft rather, to turn into a creature, and you'd much rather spend mana to make it happen. Well, it can do that. And then there are also lots of situations where the game is in its later stages and you're like, well, I may have drawn another land, but I can use this ability to make this creature into a threat and attack my opponent with it. If they take it, it's lethal, so they're going to have to trade. Like, it enables you to do more. It enabled me to do more than I expected in later stages of the game. So I'm pretty high on it right now, and right now I have it above the Landseeker, even though in the set review I gave the Landseeker a B minus and the Meccan a C plus. But now I have them switched. I mean, I still think the Landseeker is a B minus, but I think the Meccan is an even better B minus. And then I think red's best common is Plasma Bolt. 1 red mana to do 2 at sorcery speed. That's a card you're always going to play. And then throw in the fact that there are times where this can do 3 damage instead. If combat goes a certain way, if you sack a lander and have 1 mana left over, you can do it. If you warp something, it'll do it. These 1 mana cards, red got 1 and black got 1 with Void. The black one's uncommon. Both are so easy to cast when you have a window where Void happened, that they're both really nice. And I think there are 2 candidates for red's best uncommon. There's Territorial Bruntar, which can generate like really insane value because it's a 6 mana, 6/6 reach, and it has a landfall trigger that effectively draws you a card, and that's really good. I am a little lower on it, maybe, having played in the early access event, though, than I was in the set review, mostly because this set has so much good removal, and this is not a landfall trigger that you can really take advantage of. Like, there are some landfall creatures where you can get around the fact that you don't get anything out of them unless you play a land, anything permanent, any sort of permanent value out of them, until you play land by waiting to play them until you can play a land. But that doesn't really work here because you're not going to be able to play the thing you reveal. It's a small sample size, but every time I played against the Bruntar, I killed it immediately for like 3 or 4 mana, and it did not feel good for my opponents. I am worried that it's too slow in a format with this much good removal, where people can easily take it down before your opponent ever gets any value out of it. But it does have serious potential. There's no doubt about that. The trigger is good. If it stays in play, it's probably going to grind you out a win, because you'll be really happy whether you draw a land or a creature. Basically, the same thing will happen regardless of what you draw, which is good. But it does have some problems. So I think red's best uncommon might be one of those really good removal spells instead, and that is Invasive Maneuvers. It's a 2 mana deal 3, which you always play, like I've said about a lot of these great removal spells. But if you fulfill a requirement that's not that hard to meet in red, like you're going to have like 3 spacecraft in a lot of red decks. It does 5 instead, so it can kill a lot of things for 2 mana. Not quite the Bruntar. It's not one of the cards that can take it down, but it is a really good removal spell, really cheap, virtually always going to trade up, and gets especially good in the mid game when you can spend 2 to kill most things in the format. All right, let's move to green now. So I think green's 3rd best common is Drix Fatemaker. I don't think green is super deep at common. I think they have probably the best common in the set, so that's good for them. But the 2nd and 3rd best common we're going to look at here, neither of them are insane. They're just quality cards. The Fatemaker is another one of these warp creatures. It can put a counter on something when you warp it in earlier, and then it can put a counter on something else when it enters. It also gives your counter things trample. Works particularly well in green-white, but there are counters around in other colors too. And ultimately, you end up spending 6 mana for a 3/2 and 2 counters and a little bit of additional upside, which is fine. It's not great, but sometimes putting a counter on something for 2 mana gives you an attack you just didn't have before, and you're going to want to do it sometimes, especially if it helps set up other things in your same turn. So that flexibility, once again, is really good. It doesn't fill 2 slots on the curve in the same way a lot of the others do, because if you don't have a creature in play to put a counter on, well, the counter goes on itself, and then, it goes away. So it isn't as good as those that give you an effect, period, regardless of what's going on the board, like giving you a token or searching up a plains. And that's one thing that holds it back a little bit, but it is a quality common. At number 2, I have Diplomatic Relations, and if they hadn't nerfed this card, green would be a lot deeper at common. I still think it's good. I actually still think it would have been green's 2nd best common, even if the original text applied. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, they accidentally printed this card so that it wasn't only a creature you control that you could have do damage to another creature. It was just target creature, as you can probably see on the printed card that's on the screen right now. But they fixed it to do the usual green thing, which is target creature you control has to be selected. It was significantly better before the erratum because it was basically murder or close to it, because you could just point it at your opponent's creature and make it do damage to itself, or have one of their other creatures do damage to it, or whatever. So it was an incredibly flexible version of this kind of effect. And now it's more like what we usually see, which is still good, but it has this downside where you can only use it when your opponent can't interact. The upside is nice, like kill something, give your thing a buff and vigilance, attack with it, feels great. But you do have to pick your spots a lot more carefully than would have been the case with it worded how it originally was worded. But it was a pretty big color pie break, so overall, I think I'm glad they did it. Plus, green has one insane common, and that is Galactic Wayfarer, which I think is green's best common, and for me right now, the best common in the set. 3 mana, 3/3, make a lander. You know, this doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a strong 2-for-1 that synergizes with lots of things going on in the set. Also fixes, you know, even if you don't have the synergy of landfall or lander stuff going on, just fixing and ramping your mana is really good too. So it gives you a really nice 2-for-1. You know, it's not quite as good as 3 mana, 3/3, make a clue. Like that would be amazing. But it's not that far. You know, you do draw a card with it. Sometimes this is better than a clue, too. I mean, it's not a 100%. The clue is always better, but I do think it works super nicely for, you know, any green deck in the format. Any green deck, you're going to play, you know, one of the best signs of how good a common is, and it's true of all of them, except maybe Mechanozoa, because that one is kind of expensive. The others are all cards that you would play as many copies of, the ones that I have as the best common for each color. You'd play as many copies of them as you could get. And that's, you know, that's a great sign. And that's definitely what the Wayfarer has going on. So green's got really good commons. Let's look at the uncommons now. And this one, I think, is a little bit contentious based on the comments in my set review. And that is Atmospheric Greenhouse. So I think overall people are really underrating how difficult stationing is, or overrating how difficult it is, I guess, and underrating the spacecraft overall. If a spacecraft has an interest trigger that does something immediately, it's going to be good. That's pretty much how it's going to be, I think. You know, we'll see when the data really comes out. I could be wrong, but I think a comparison that I should have made in the set review that I think will help convince you how good this is how well it compares with that Loxodon with Convoke, right? That was a 4/4 that came down and had Convoke, and you could tap all of your creatures, and any creature you tapped for it got a counter, right? That's basically what this is. It's not quite as good. You can't count it. You can't cast it at an extreme discount. But this is going to come down, put counters on all your things. Those things with counters can now turn it into a creature. And it's a pretty formidable creature. Like, that's what's going to happen with this card. That's how good it is. I mean, it is. I didn't give a bomb grade to a single spacecraft in the set because there is a limit on how high of a grade you can give a card that does need stuff on the board to be at its best. So, you know, I gave B pluses. This one I gave a B, which is, I think, the highest grade I gave to a non-rare or mythic one. So they're not, you know, they're not going to be insane in 100% of situations, but on your typical board state in this format, when you play the greenhouse, it's going to put counters on all your things and then turn into a creature. That's basically what's going to happen. And that's a great card. And it's the only one of these spacecraft I have on this list, which further shows you that, you know, I'm pretty high on them, but it's tempered to the point that I don't think that many of them are at the very top of the list. But I do think this one is. Atmospheric Greenhouse looks excellent to me. All right, so those are my picks for the best commons and uncommons in Edge of Eternities. Next week, we probably still won't have enough data for me to do the What I Got Wrong video, but I will have enough drafts under my belt that I can put out some broad feelings about the format. You got some of them here. I think stationing is very doable, and I think warp's really good. Those are two things you picked up as broad feelings about the format. We'll see whether I still feel that way a week from now. But for now, that does it for this video. If you want to check out my draft videos or my set review for Edge of Eternities, you should see the playlists on your screen shortly. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. Thanks for watching.